Motoring 94 is brought to you by Quaker State. Quaker State, one tough motor oil. And Midas, for brake, exhaust, suspension, and steering service. Trust your car to Midas.
Along with a house, purchasing a car is usually one of the biggest material decisions you and I will ever make. Hello everybody and welcome to Motoring 94. Now, when you buy a house, you usually have a lawyer. He can sort through all that mumbo jumbo and present you with your house free and clear. Now, when you buy a used car privately, that's a different matter. For the most part, it's buyer beware. Well, recently, legislation was introduced in the province of Ontario. Legislation the government says will protect you and I, the consumer, from being ripped off when we privately buy that used car from someone's driveway. This building on the corner of Yonge and Wellesley in downtown Toronto is home to the Ontario Ministry of Consumer and Commercial Relations. It was here we talked to Bob Pierce, Registrar for Motor Vehicle Dealers in Ontario.
In Ontario, there's a little over 1.2 million cars sold annually in the province. Now, a certain percentage are dealer transactions, but 3 to 1 are private sales. There are 3 cars sold privately for every one a dealer sells. And Ontario now, taking into consideration that that's a lot of money involved, has brought out the used vehicle information package in response to a lot of consumer demand for it. It's not always easy to get information of where this car you're planning to spend $5,000 to $10,000 to $15,000 to $20,000, where it's come from, who's owned it before you, whether there's a lien on it. And we've spent a lot of money to make this document available right across the province. I'm going to sell my car to you. Again, I have to go to the Ministry of Transport to get the document, or if I'm not convenient to one of those offices, I can phone in and get the information using a credit card, so we've made it sort of accessible. And I'm going to have to show you where, if my car is truly the one-owner gem that you expect to be buying, that's what it says on paper, that the car is going to look as good on paper as it does on the driveway now. And if it doesn't, then things like if the car was a daily rental vehicle, are going to show up on the history. If it was a leased car, it's going to show up on the history. If it's bounced around the wholesale market for 5 and 6 and 7 times before I got the car, then you're going to know that information. More importantly, look for things like insurance companies' names or banks' names in the history, because you're going to find out the cars were repoed or they were accident damaged, especially the insurance part of it. If an insurance company bought my car, the only reason that is I probably wrote it off. So from the history perspective, there's going to be a lot of good information in there.
Terry Fox is the manager of the Legal Advisory Department for the Canadian Automobile Association. He agrees consumers need better protection, but is convinced the used vehicle information package is not the answer.
Well, I think what the government has done is to get a sweet deal for them. They're going to charge you $20 for a piece of paper that doesn't really tell you anything more than you could have received at the time before this package went into effect. Prior to October the 4th, you could go down to the government and you could do a search on liens, and you could do a search of the history of the registered owners of the motor vehicle. You've gone to 2 different places and paid 2 different fees. But the information which was available is exactly the same today. It's just that it's now in one piece of paper where you pay $20 to the government. But you don't get anything more than what you got before.
Why then?
Well, I think the government would like us to believe that you're getting some sort of consumer protection. But in my view, you do not. There's nothing in there, for example, that tells you what the odometer readings were of that car, whether it was ever written off or was considered a salvage vehicle. We don't know how long the vehicle package is going to last. Is there a time limit on it? They haven't announced it, at least so far. What would be any other protections that would be available don't seem to be anywhere on the document. In other words, anything that was available before.
There is no expiry date on this information package. It's good until the car is transferred. So conceivably, a seller could fill out this package, then go out, get a loan using that car as collateral, then sell you the car with what is now a false document.
Well, again, to the consumer purchaser, the document obviously is generated as soon as you request it. So all of it comes off the system. it's as accurate to that minute. And yes, if somebody wants to defraud someone, they can do it. They can get the document one day, and they could in fact go out and put a lien on the car and sell it the next day. So again, the consumer buyer's got to be aware that yeah, if they're dealing with a crook, then they can be. Yeah, you can get ripped off. But what we put in place right now is better than what's ever been out in the marketplace, and we haven't seen those problems yet. And we may have to adjust if those things happen.
What it will say on the document, it will give you the name of the registrant. In other words, the person whose name appears on a piece of paper called a motor vehicle permit. It doesn't mean that he is actually the owner in fact. There could be some dispute as to who is the true owner. Oftentimes these cars may be the subject of a divorce proceeding, for example, or they could have been cars that were used in business and there's some sort of dispute as to who the true owner is. The person who's named as the registrant doesn't necessarily have possession of the car. He hasn't necessarily paid off all which is owed on the car, and he may not be the true owner. And so you may have a problem having to go to court and paying expensive court fees and expensive lawyers to determine who the true owner is. That's happened many times in both this province and other provinces in Canada. As well, if you do a search using the vehicle information package, it will only show Ontario registrations. It will not show if it was registered in Quebec or Saskatchewan or New Brunswick or anywhere else from that matter. This car could have been taken across and registered in all the provinces of Canada and all the states in the USA, and all you could find out is what is registered in Ontario. You might have 20 previous registrations, but if they were all done outside of Ontario, they wouldn't show up.
When searching for outstanding liens against the automobile, the new package uses the car's serial number. Fox says that is not going far enough.
And the other was what is known as doing a non-specific debtor name inquiry. That means to go after the person who is named as the registered owner. Sometimes these vehicles are not always caught on the system by serial number, and they can be registered by name, and you should check the name. Now, my understanding is that if you do a vehicle information package, it will only show the search by the serial number. It's possible that there could be a lien registered by name only and may not come up by a serial number search.
Buying a car privately can be attractive for a couple of reasons. One, you don't have to pay GST, and two, you can usually negotiate the price. Well, you still don't have to pay the GST, but now you must buy the car for the Red Book value.
This is the Red Book. Now, it's published monthly. It's published by McLean Hunter Publications, and the government says that if you're going to purchase a vehicle in Ontario privately, no matter what you actually paid for it, this book is what you're going to pay tax on. In other words, the government says you will pay 8% provincial sales tax on the wholesale price of the Red Book. And this is the, as far as taxation goes, this is the Holy Bible for taxation in Ontario.
Right or wrong?
Right or wrong. Now, you can, of course, get an appraisal at your cost, which is not always the easiest thing. If you have a car that's worth $500, how much is it going to cost to get an appraisal?
Many believe this new legislation is aimed at the curbsiders. These are characters who set up their own underground business buying and selling used cars.
You see, what we used to find out was the curbsider would sell a car to the buyer and say, do you want the bill of sale for half price? For half the amount, and if I was a curbsider, I'd say things like, well, that extra couple hundred you're going to save in retail sales tax, that'll pay for the safety check. And you might say, okay, that's fine, I'll do that. And when you find out you've been ripped off and the car falls apart, is it likely you're going to complain to the police or the ministry or the tax people? You violated the Retail Sales Tax Act, not the seller. And a lot of curbsiders would catch the unsuspecting purchaser in that game, and we put an end to it.
Well, I would rather go to a dealer if I were buying the used car. That's what I would do. A good, reputable dealer. The dealer is liable for the liens. He's liable for all sorts of other things. Now, admittedly, the dealer is not liable to tell you that the car was, for example, in an accident. Under the Motor Vehicle Dealers Act, or at least the regulations under that act, it says that whether the car was a taxi cab or a police vehicle, under those circumstances, he must reveal it, but he doesn't have to tell you much else. So you don't have all that great a protection from a dealer, but at least you have the protection on liens, and which is a reasonably substantial protection.
As far as protection goes, you're into a situation where it's a private transaction. The information we're giving you is the best information the public and the lending institutions gave to us. So it's as accurate as that.
So it appears this vehicle information package is a step in the right direction, yet it still can leave consumers with a false sense of security. Is there a better way? Well, litigation lawyer Rod Thibodeau says there is.
I'm absolutely convinced that the certificate of title system in the 51 states in the U.S. is the way that we should be going in this province. And I have an example of the Michigan system here with the 4 certificates of title. These documents are actual legal evidence of title. Any of these motor vehicles or crafts cannot be transferred, that is sold or in any other way transferred without this legal document going with the vehicle. And on the first examples of the certificate of title relating to the motor vehicle, what we see is an identification of the motor vehicle with odometer indicating actual mileage, the owner of the motor vehicle according to the actual title document, and the registered secured party. So unless this information, this document is dealt with properly according to Michigan law, the vehicle can't be sold or otherwise transferred. If this system, as I believe it to be, is a 10 with respect to consumer protection, then this information package is probably a 1.
You've just seen bureaucracy in action. My comments coming up later on Kenzie's Corner. I'll bet you can't wait.
Test Drive with Graham Fletcher.
This week on Test Drive, we look at the 1994 Ford Mustang. Now, this is the 30th anniversary of the car, and as such, Ford are billing this as the rebirth of a legend. In informal discussions with prospective customers, Ford discovered one thing. The new car must retain its strong North American image, meaning no European or Japanese influence. For me, Ford have succeeded. They've retained both the style and image in keeping with the Mustang nameplate. The inside of this Mustang has got several big pluses and one major drawback. The pluses, dual airbags, one for each passenger. All of the ergonomics are wonderful, all of the controls right within easy reach, and all of the switches have a nice tactile feel. The drawback? The interior is just so bland and boring, it totally lacks the inspiration that the rest of the car has. A lot of the styling cues are nothing more than that. The scoops on the side and hood are more for show than function. The side scoops succeed in keeping the tyres cool. Only when you add your own ducting will they become functional and cool the brakes. The hood scoops do lower underhood temperatures marginally, but the difference is hardly worth talking about. The convertible will be produced in-house and comes with a real glass rear screen and an optional hardtop that tips the scales at just 85 pounds. With the hardtop in place, the convertible looks exactly the same as the coupe. This is the 1994 Mustang body. Now, everything that you see that's painted white is a carryover part from last year's vehicle. Everything that's been painted blue has been significantly updated to accommodate the changes in the new car. Now, all of the red stuff is totally new. On the convertible, what they've done to eliminate a lot of the cowl shape they had in last year's model, they've tripled the thickness of the rocker panel when compared to the base car, added this X-brace, and this interesting mass vibration damper. That's the technology. The question is, does it work? The answer is very effectively so, because out on the open road there's very little in the way of cowl shake. Indeed, the only time that it really shows up is when you get onto badly broken pavement. This car's torsional rigidity is so good, it could teach the Supra a lesson or two. The new car features a wider track and longer wheelbase. That and the reworked suspension improve the handling characteristics immensely. Up front you'll find the usual McPherson struts. However, repositioning the front crossmember and adding longer lower control arms has increased the caster by 2.5 degrees. This greatly improves steering feel and directional stability.
The rear suspension on the GT gets 4 shock absorbers, 2 in the usual position and 2 mounted horizontally. These 2 are designed to minimize wind-up during hard acceleration. You'll also find tubular sway bars both back and front. Now you not only have a car that handles, but one that is also considerably more comfortable, especially in the convertible version. The base tyres on the GT are a set of 225/55 ZR16s. Take my advice and pay the extra and go for the optional 245/45 ZR 17-inch tyres. These things make the most of the new car's agility as well as being a lot more forgiving at the limit. The powertrain is, for the most part, a carryover from the old car, the exception being the base engine, which is now a 145-horse 3.8-litre V6. The GTs retain the old 5-litre V8. Power is rated at 215 horses and 285 pounds-feet of torque. In the dash to the 100k mark, the Mustang required 5.9 seconds. Matched with the old engine is the old 5-speed manual transmission. This time around, however, they've improved clutch feel and performance to the point where the car is now easy to drive around town. Now that is something you could not say about the old car. Compare that lot to the Camaro, which is something that is inevitable, and the Mustang comes up short in a couple of important areas. The car is 60 horses shy under the hood and 1 cog fewer in the gearbox. I must admit to being very disappointed on both counts, especially when I found out that there is no immediate plan to utilize the wonderful 4-cam 4.6-litre V8 found in the Mark 8. At least that engine would give Ford the lead in the horsepower battle. I did learn, however, that this engine will fit under the hood and it may eventually find its way there. I, for one, sincerely hope so. The upgrades to the brake system are extensive. To start with, you now get disc brakes at all 4 corners, a larger booster and a long overdue anti-lock option, the latter being Bosch's sophisticated ABS2 system. This system actually learns from the first cycle and adjusts for optimum performance. The advantage being that you now get maximum directional stability with the shortest stopping distances on all road surfaces, a huge step forward by any standards. When it comes to cars, Jim Kenzie and I seldom differ. However, I must take issue with his comments he made on last week's Kenzie's Corner regarding the Mustang. He said some pretty derogatory things. As far as I'm concerned, the styling, the power, the suspension are all wonderful. The interior, not too keen on it. However, come January '94, when they introduced the Cobra GT and its 230 horses, this car will give the Camaro a serious run for its money.
Our Midas tip of the week concerns corrosion in brake systems. Every time you park your car, a little bit of corrosion takes place. Now this one's been parked for 10 days, and there's a significant blotch of corrosion on this rotor that corresponds with the outline of the brake pad. You can feel it, and the first time you apply the brakes in this car, you'd actually hear some scraping noises coming out of that wheel, and you'd have a rough application, possibly grabbing on that wheel. And that's something that's unavoidable. The brake pad will scuff that off and smooth it away, and it will disappear. But over a period of time, it can build up to a point where it severely affects the operation of your brakes. It may be cause for resurfacing the rotor or possibly even replacing with new disc brake rotors. That's your Midas tip of the week.
Incidentally, next week, Graham Fletcher will be test driving a Lada. It's a first for Graham. You won't want to miss it. All right, it's now time to head to the Motoring 94 garage and join Bill Gardner.
Brad, this week I want to talk about distributor systems. As the name implies, the distributor system distributes the high voltage produced by the ignition coil to the appropriate cylinders in a distinct firing sequence and at the correct time. And that timing, or ignition timing, will vary according to engine load and engine speed. And in most cases, distributors always had some provision to adjust that. Now, there's the distributor shaft, and that's turning. In this case, it's gear driven off the camshaft on this engine. This one's a V8 distributor out of a Chevrolet. And down here we can see the part we refer to as the pickup coil. And there's a set of teeth on this pickup coil, one for every cylinder. So there's 8 of those. And every time one of those teeth lines up on the pickup coil, a small AC voltage is produced in these 2 wires, and that triggers the electronic ignition module over here. Now the module, its job is to electrically turn on and off the ignition coil. And the coil is up here, in this case, in the top of the distributor cap. That's where the high voltage is produced that produces the spark in the engine, about 30,000 volts. Now, in this case, the ignition coil acts directly on the rotor without a coil wire. There's just a carbon brush right here that contacts the rotor blade. And the rotor, as we showed you before, is sitting on this distributor shaft and turning. And it's going to turn around and alternately line with all these distributor cap terminals, 8 of them here. And on those terminals, we have the spark plug wires going to the appropriate cylinder. That's how the spark is going to be delivered to those cylinders at the right time. And that can be varied in this case by a set of weights that's going to switch the timing according to engine speed, and a vacuum chamber that's going to switch timing according to engine load. Now, over the years, a lot of components have disappeared from the distributor. In the early 70s, the points and condenser disappeared. They were replaced by the pickup coil and module that did the same thing electronically. In the middle 80s, this set of weights and the vac advance disappeared, and timing control came into the electronic engine computer, the computer that runs and manages the engine control system. So we no longer need those two components. And in many cases on today's cars, we've eliminated the distributor completely. A lot of the V6 engines in today's cars do not have a distributor. They just have a multiple set of ignition coils, each coil firing 2 cylinders. And next week, we're going to show you one of those distributorless ignition systems. Till then, I'm Bill Gardner for Motoring 94.
Kenzie's Corner with Jim Kenzie.
Call me naive, but I still cling to the old-fashioned concept that governments are supposed to make our lives simpler. Well, this doesn't make my life any simpler. This is the latest bit of bureaucratic nonsense to emanate from the government of the province I happen to live in, which is Ontario. This is the Used Vehicle Information Package. You gotta buy this for $20 anytime you want to sell a used car privately in this province. It contains a bunch of documents that you've got to fill in with information the government already has on file anyway, and give it to the buyer of your car. Now, I made a point of buying this little number, executive driven only on weekends, one owner, before this legislation came into effect, just to avoid this bureaucratic hassle. Now, the theory behind this, and bureaucrats always have a theory, is that occasionally people buy used cars that have liens against them. That means the previous owner owes money to a mechanic for repairs he'd had done, or maybe he used the car as collateral for a loan. But come on, how often does this really happen? Surely anybody who's buying a used car knows enough to check into things like this on their own. Now, maybe this is a plot by used car dealers to direct business onto their lots. After all, if buying a used car privately becomes more of a hassle, you're going to go to the dealership and let them look after the paperwork. Or maybe this is just a $20 tax grab by the government. Geez, you get cynical in this business. And just because you don't live in Ontario, don't think this can't happen to you. These people talk to each other.
Well, after what we've seen and heard this week, I'm sure there are some people who believe that everyone who sells a used car privately is a crook. Well, that's simply not true. It's still buyer beware. And despite this new legislation introduced in the province of Ontario, as we've seen, it does not protect consumers completely. It's still our job to ask the necessary questions. What I hope we have shown you this week is that there are people out there who have the answers. That's it for now. We'll see you next week for more stories about cars and the people who drive them.
Motoring 94 has been brought to you by Quaker State. Quaker State, one tough motor oil. And Midas, for brake, exhaust, suspension, and steering service. Trust your car to Midas.